Tonight, let's be stepping back into a world lit only by fire and moonlight. Forget your phone, your laptop, the glowing digital clock by your bed. Imagine a darkness so profound it felt like a physical presence, a vast, quiet ocean that swallowed the world every evening. We modern humans are obsessed with achieving a perfect, uninterrupted 8-hour block of sleep, treating any deviation as a sign of disorder. But what if I told you that for most of human history, that was the furthest thing from the norms? Our medieval ancestors inhabited the night in a way that would seem utterly bizarre to us today. Their relationship with sleep wasn't about efficiency or optimization. It was a fluid, two-act play dictated by the setting of the sun and the deep, instinctual rhythms of the human body. So settle in and let's explore the strange, forgotten world of how people used to sleep. The foundational rhythm of life before the Industrial Revolution was a practice now known as segmented sleep. This wasn't a quirky habit of a few eccentrics. It was the default setting for nearly everyone in the Western world. Imagine your night's rest not as a single, solid block, but as two distinct halves, separated by a period of quiet wakefulness. This pattern wasn't seen as a problem to be solved. There was no medieval equivalent of counting sheep or drinking chamomile tea to force yourself back under. Instead, this natural biphasic cycle was simply the way things were. People would go to bed, enjoy a deep, first sleep, and then naturally drift awake for an hour or two before returning for their second sleep. A schedule that followed the sun's departure and return with unwavering fidelity. The man we have to thank for rediscovering this lost chapter of human consciousness is the historian A. Roger Kirch. He wasn't searching for kings or epic battles. He was a historical detective on the hunt for the texture of everyday life. For years, he meticulously combed through forgotten archives, poring over personal diaries, court records, medical texts, and even ancient plays. He noticed a persistent, yet unexplained, patterns. Repeated references to a first and second sleep. These weren't isolated incidents. They were scattered across centuries of documentation, hiding in plain sight. Kirch realized he had stumbled upon a fundamental aspect of the human experience that had been completely erased from our collective memory by the glare of the modern age. Kirch compiled his groundbreaking findings in his book, At Day's Close Night in Times Past. This wasn't just a dry academic paper. It was the culmination of over 16 years of dedicated, painstaking research. He built an unshakable case by assembling an overwhelming mosaic of evidence from more than 500 different sources. The book acts as a portal, transporting the reader back to a time when the night was a different country. It reveals how the onset of darkness shaped social customs, religious practices, and even crime. He demonstrates that this segmented sleep pattern was not a footnote in history, but a central, organizing principle of life itself, a rhythm that was only undone by the artificial light that conquered the night. As dusk settled over a medieval village, a different kind of quiet would descend. Without the hum of electricity or the glow of streetlights, the end of the day was absolute. The day's labor, which was almost entirely dictated by the availability of natural light, would cease. Families would gather for a simple meal, huddle around the hearth for a bit of warmth and conversation, then, not long after sunset, they would retire for the evening. This wasn't laziness, it was practicality. They climbed into bed and drifted off into what they called their first sleep, a deep, restorative rest that would last for approximately 4 hours, carrying them to the midpoint of the long, dark night. Around midnight, a gentle, natural awakening would occur across the household. Far from being a source of anxiety, this period of wakefulness was an expected and accepted part of the nightly routine. It was known as the watch. This wasn't the groggy, frustrating wakefulness of modern insomnia. It was a serene and lucid state of consciousness. In the profound silence of the pre-industrial night, this 1 to 2 hour intermission was a unique time for introspection and activity. It was a pocket of personal time carved out of the darkness, a quiet island of wakefulness between two seas of sleep, valued for its tranquility and its potential for productivity. So what do people during this midnight waking period? The possibilities were as varied as the people themselves. This was a time for quiet, personal, and sometimes communal activities. For the pious, it was an ideal moment for prayer and spiritual contemplation, as recommended in many religious texts of the era. For the more practical-minded, it was a chance to stoke the dying embers of the fire, to ensure the house remained warm, check on sleeping children or livestock, or even perform small chores like mending clothes or brewing a bit of ale. It was a period of calm productivity, free from the social demands and harsh labor of the daylight hours. The watch was also a time for more personal pursuits. People would use the quiet hours to reflect on their dreams, which were often seen as potent omens or messages. It was a chance to have a private conversation with a spouse, free from the prying ears of a crowded household. Medical texts from the period even advised that this was the ideal time for marital intimacy, as both partners were rested from their first sleep and not yet burdened by the anxieties of the coming day. Neighbors might even pay short, quiet visits to one another. It was a strangely social time, a shared, silent understanding that the world was awake and alive in the heart of the night. In an age before modern medicine, advice on health and wellness was woven deeply into the fabric of daily life, and this extended to the watch. Physicians and authors of domestic guidebooks from the 16th century frequently cited the period after the first sleep as the most favorable time for conception. The logic was straightforward and compelling. A couple would be more rested and energetic than they were at the end of a long day of physical labor. This belief was so widespread that it wasn't just folklore, it was accepted medical wisdom of the time, suggesting that this waking period wasn't just useful, but was considered essential for the health and continuation of the family. After an hour or two of these quiet activities, a natural drowsiness would set in once more. As the watch came to a close, people would simply return to their beds and drift off into their second sleep. This second period of rest was often described in diaries and letters as being lighter and more dream-filled than the first. It would last until the first hints of dawn began to streak the sky, signaling the start of a new day of labor. This two-part rhythm defined the night, providing a structure that was both practical for their lives and, as modern science is beginning to understand, perhaps more natural for our own biology. This ancient, Buffisic sleep pattern, which had dominated human life for millennia, began to unravel with startling speed in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The catalyst for this profound shift was a single, transformative invention: effective artificial lighting. First came gaslit city streets, then powerful interior lamps, and finally, the widespread adoption of the electric light bulb. Suddenly, the night was no longer an impassable barrier. It became a new frontier for work, socializing, and entertainment. The night was colonized by light, and our ancestral sleep patterns were one of the first casualties of this new, illuminated world. As the Industrial Revolution gained momentum, so too did a new cultural mindset that prized productivity and efficiency above all else. The leisurely, introspective watch period came to be seen as a waste of time, a sign of idleness in a world that was increasingly governed by the factory clock. A single, uninterrupted block of sleep became the new ideal. It was efficient and disciplined. By the early 20th century, the concept of a first and second sleep had been so completely erased from public consciousness that it lingered only as a historical curiosity. The idea of waking in the night, once normal, was now pathologized and branded as insomnia, a medical problem requiring a cure. For most people in the Middle Ages, the concept of privacy as we know it today simply did not exist. A private bedroom was a luxury reserved for the highest echelons of the nobility. For everyone else, from peasants to merchants to household servants, sleeping was a fundamentally communal activity. This wasn't just a matter of saving space, it was driven by the practical needs for warmth and security. In a world of drafty homes and unlit streets, huddling together in a shared space offered protection from the cold and from any potential dangers that lurked in the darkness. Beds were large, and they were meant to be shared. The reality of a medieval household's sleeping arrangement would shock the modern sensibility. It was entirely common for an entire family, mother, father, and several children, to share a single large mattress, which was often just a sack filled with straw or feathers placed on the floor or a simple wooden frame. But it didn't stop there. If guests or travelers arrived, they would often be invited to join the pile. Even household servants frequently slept in the same room as their masters, either in the same bed or on smaller cots or pallets nearby. The bedroom was not a private sanctuary. It was a bustling, semi-public space for the entire domestic unit. Perhaps no single object better encapsulates this lost world of communal sleeping than the great bed of ware. This is not a myth or a legend. It is a very real, colossal piece of furniture that you can still see today at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Carved from solid oak around the year 1590, it wasn't built for a king or a queen. It was constructed as a novelty attraction for a local inn in the town of Ware, Hertfordshire. Its express purpose was to draw in curious travellers and drum up business by offering a sleeping experience unlike any other in England. To say the Great Bed of Ware is large is a significant understatement. It is a monumental piece of furniture, measuring an astonishing 10 feet wide and 11 feet long. To put that in perspective, it is wider than two modern king-size beds pushed together. The headboard and canopy are intricately carved with elaborate patterns and inlaid with fine marquetry, showcasing the incredible skill of its creator, a carpenter named Jonas Fosbrook. It was famously reported to be capable of sleeping at least 4 couples comfortably, and tales from the time claimed that as many as 12 people had slept in it at once, making it a true spectacle of its era. The bed quickly became a sensation. Travellers would go out of their way to visit the inn in Ware just for the chance to spend a night in the famous bed. It became a kind of 16th century tourist trap, and visitors developed a tradition of carving their initials or leaving wax seals on the bedposts to commemorate their stay, a form of historical graffiti that can still be seen today. The bed's fame was so widespread that it even received a mention from William Shakespeare in his play Twelfth Night, where a character jokes about a sheet of paper being large enough to cover the massive bed, cementing its place in cultural history, while the general population was settling into their two-part sleep cycle. A very different and far more disciplined nocturnal schedule was being observed within the stone walls of Europe's monasteries. The lives of monks revolved not around the sun, but around God. Their sleep was intentionally and frequently interrupted for the sacred duty of prayer. This wasn't a matter of personal choice. It was a highly structured and rigorous routine that had been codified centuries earlier, designed to ensure that worship was offered to God at all hours of the day and night, transforming sleep itself into an act of religious devotion. This rigorous monastic schedule was laid out in a 6th century document known as the Rule of Saint Benedict. This text became the foundational guide for Western monasticism, a comprehensive handbook that governed every aspect of a monk's life, from manual labor and mealtimes to the precise structure of their worship. The rule divided the day and night into a series of 8 prayer services, known as the canonical hours. This divine timetable was the unyielding rhythm of monastery life, and it demanded that the monks rise from their beds in the dead of night to gather in the cold chapel for prayer. The most significant interruption to a monk's sleep was the service known as matins, or the night office. This prayer service was held at the 8th hour of the night, which typically meant waking around 2 a.m. This was not an accident. The timing was deliberate, designed as an act of ascetic discipline and spiritual vigilance. To facilitate this, monks slept in a communal dormitory, often remaining fully clothed in their habits so they could proceed directly to the church upon waking. After the final prayer of the evening, compline, a strict rule of silence was observed until the morning, making the solemn, candlelit procession to matins a profoundly quiet and contemplative ritual in the heart of the darkness. Within the frozen silence of a monastery, the call to prayer was a profound and sacred intrusion. The vigils, or matins service, deliberately shattered the deepest part of the night's rest. Imagine being roused from your slumber, not by a gentle dawn, but by the solemn toll of a bell around 2 a.m. The monks would rise from their simple beds into the biting cold of the dormitory, their breath fogging in the air. This act was a powerful form of spiritual discipline, a conscious sacrifice of physical comfort for communion with the divine. It was a belief that in the absolute stillness of the world, when all of creation was asleep, their prayers were at their most potent, rising unobstructed to the heavens. Life in the monastic dormitory, or dorter, was a testament to the principles of humility and communal living. There were no private chambers, only long rows of simple pallets, often stuffed with straw. Personal comfort was not the objective, spiritual readiness was. Monks typically slept in their full habits. The woolen robes providing some measure of warmth against the stone walls and ensuring they were prepared to answer the call to prayer at a moment's notice. The atmosphere was one of quiet, shared purpose. It was a space devoid of personal possessions, where the individual was subsumed into the collective body of the community, all waiting in the darkness for the bell that would call them back to their shared work of worship. The final prayer of the day, known as compline, was a beautiful and solemn ritual that marked a definitive transition from the secular world to the sacred night. As the last notes of the chants faded in the chapel, a great silence would descend upon the entire monastery. This wasn't merely a rule against talking, it was a deeply spiritual practice. The silence was meant to quiet the mind, allowing for contemplation and guarding against idle or sinful thoughts before sleep. It created a protective barrier against the noise of the world, transforming the monastery into a sanctuary of peace and turning the following hours of darkness, including the interruption for matins, into a continuous, unbroken act of devotion. The darkness of the Middle Ages thus held two profoundly different experiences of wakefulness. For the ordinary layperson, the watch was a relaxed, earthly, and often social interlude, a time for intimacy, quiet chores, or sharing a warm drink by the hearth. It was a natural pause in a natural rhythm. For the monk, the nightly waking was its stark opposite, a highly structured, deeply ascetic, and spiritually demanding duty. It was a deliberate breaking of the body's rhythm to prioritize the soul's obligation. One was a quiet celebration of worldly life in the heart of the night. The other was a solemn renunciation of it, a vigil kept for God while the rest of the world slept. Could it be that our modern struggle with sleep is, in fact, a kind of historical amnesia? When we find ourselves staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., our minds buzzing, we immediately pathologize the experience. We call it insomnia and see it as a malfunction of a system that is supposed to deliver 8 uninterrupted hours. But perhaps what we are feeling is a faint echo of an older, more natural rhythm. Our pre-industrial ancestors would have simply accepted this waking period as the watch, a useful and peaceful intermission. It is possible that our bodies, under the constant assault of artificial light and the pressures of a 2047 world, are simply trying to revert to a biphasic sleep pattern that is more deeply ingrained in our biology than we realize. The year is 1692. In the small, isolated Puritan communities of colonial Massachusetts, something terrible is about to be unleashed. The Salem witch trials were more than a mere historical event. They were a perfect and terrifying storm, a vortex where simmering social anxieties, political instability, and extreme religious dogma converged to produce a maelstrom of paranoia and death. For a few brief, nightmarish months, the invisible world of demons and specters became terrifyingly real, and the accusations of a few hysterical girls were enough to send their neighbors to the gallows. It stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how quickly the foundations of a society can crumble into dust when reason is abandoned in favor of fear. To understand the madness that took hold of Salem, you must first understand the suffocating atmosphere of dread that permeated every aspect of life in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These were a people living on the edge of a vast, dark, and seemingly endless wilderness, which they believed to be the literal domain of the devil. Their Puritan faith was rigid and demanding, fostering a deep-seated paranoia about sin and damnation. This ever-present spiritual anxiety was dangerously compounded by very real-world troubles, creating a powder keg of collective fear. The colonists felt they were fighting a war on two fronts. One against the harsh realities of their environment, and another against the invisible forces of evil they believed were constantly trying to destroy them. The abstract fear of the devil was given a terrifyingly concrete form by the brutal conflict known as King William's War. This was not a distant battle fought by armies overseas. It was a savage frontier war waged against the French and their Native American allies. and its violence was spilling into the communities of New England. Towns to the north of Salem had been raided and burned. Refugees, many of them orphaned or widowed, streamed into Essex County, bringing with them first-hand accounts of unspeakable brutality. This constant, real-world terror created a state of heightened panic, making it tragically easy for the colonists to believe that the devil was now employing witches within their own communities to finish the job. Adding to this climate of intense fear was a profound political and legal crisis. In 1684, King James II had revoked the Massachusetts Bay Colony's original charter, the foundational document that had granted it the right to self-governance. This single act plunged the colony into a state of chaos. Without a legal charter, there was no legitimate government, no legally recognized governor, and no valid framework for the courts. The colonists felt they were adrift, abandoned by their king and their legal traditions. This power vacuum created a desperate craving for order and authority, a void that the zealous witchcraft magistrates would soon be all too willing to fill with their own brand of terrible justice. Beneath the colony-wide anxieties lay a deep and bitter rift within the community of Salem itself. The conflict pitted the residents of the agrarian, poorer, and more religiously conservative Salem village against the more prosperous, mercantile, and worldly residents of Salem town. For years, resentments had festered over disputed land, unpaid debts, and, most significantly, the choice of the village minister. These were not minor disagreements. They were deep-seated feuds that created a toxic atmosphere of gossip, envy, and animosity. This fractured community was a landscape of ready-made rivalries, where a supernatural accusation could become the perfect weapon to settle a very old and earthly score. The first flickers of the coming inferno appeared in the most volatile place imaginable, the home of the Salem village minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. In the winter of 1692, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to exhibit terrifying and inexplicable symptoms. They would scream uncontrollably, contort their bodies into unnatural positions, and complain of being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. In a community steeped in the supernatural and lacking any other medical or psychological explanation, the diagnosis was swift and chilling. The girls were under an evil hand. They were bewitched, and the hunt for their tormentors was about to begin. The first person to be dragged into this nightmare, tried and ultimately executed, was a woman named Bridget Bishop. She was in many ways the perfect scapegoat for a community obsessed with rigid conformity. Bishop was an outsider in her own town. She had been married 3 times, was known for her sharp tongue and independent spirit, and, perhaps most damningly, she owned a tavern on the road to Salem town and was known to wear a brightly coloured red bodice. In the drab, monochrome world of Puritan New England, her refusal to be subdued and her association with the public house, a place of worldly entertainment and idle gossip, made her an object of suspicion long before the first accusations of witchcraft were ever uttered. Evidence brought forth to condemn Bridget Bishop was a flimsy tapestry woven from local gossip, personal grudges, and supernatural fantasy. Neighbours claimed she had caused their pigs to die or their beer to spoil with a mere glance. Men testified that her spectre had visited them in the night, lying on their chests and trying to torment them. The most damning physical proof was the discovery of poppets in the wall of her home, small dolls with pins stuck in them. which were considered unambiguous tools of malefic magic. In the supercharged atmosphere of the courtroom, these spectral claims and dubious discoveries were treated not as delusion or hearsay, but as incontrovertible proof of a pact with the devil. The legal mechanism that allowed such flimsy accusations to condemn a person to death was the insidious doctrine of spectral evidence. This was the dark heart of the Salem trials. It decreed that the visions and testimony of the afflicted, their claims that they could see the ghost or spectre of the accused actively tormenting them, were admissible in court as a form of legitimate evidence. This created a legal system that was impossible to defend against. How could Bridget Bishop, or any of the accused, prove that her spirit hadn't flown across town to pinch a young girl? You cannot produce a witness to refute a phantom, and so the accuser's visions became undeniable truths. The man who drove the legal machinery of the trials with unbending conviction was the Deputy Governor and Chief Magistrate, William Stoughton. A man of immense pride and rigid Puritan zeal, Stoughton was utterly convinced that Massachusetts was under a direct, full-scale assault by Satan's legions. He became the court's most powerful and ardent defender of spectral evidence, seeing it not as a flawed legal concept, but as a necessary tool given to them by Providence to fight the devil. He consistently overruled any skepticism from other magistrates or juries, his powerful position and unwavering certainty lending an air of grim legitimacy to the escalating hysteria and ensuring the trials would proceed with ruthless efficiency. If there was a single moment when the community should have recoiled in horror from the precipice, it was the accusation of Rebecca Nurse. She was a 71-year-old matriarch, frail and deeply respected for her piety and gentle nature. She was the very model of a good Puritan woman. When her name was uttered by the accusers, a palpable shockwave went through the village. Her case demonstrated with terrifying clarity that the circle of accusation was no longer confined to social outcasts or troublesome neighbours. The madness was now consuming the core of the community, proving that no amount of good character or devout faith could protect you from the pointing finger of an afflicted girl. The accusation against Rebecca Nurse was so unbelievable to those who knew her that it prompted a remarkable and courageous act of defiance. A petition was drawn up and circulated among her neighbours, attesting to her good character and Christian virtue. 39 upstanding members of the community put their names to this document, a testament to Nurse's sterling reputation. In a climate of such intense fear, where speaking out in defence of an accused witch could easily lead to one's own accusation, signing this petition was an act of immense bravery. It was a formal declaration to the court that they believed the accusers were wrong. A significant crack in the facade of unanimity the magistrates sought to project. The trial of Rebecca Nurse became a dramatic public battle between reason and hysteria. After hearing the evidence and the powerful testimony of her neighbours, the jury returned a verdict that seemed to signal a return to sanity, not guilty. But the moment the verdict was read, the afflicted girls in the courtroom erupted into violent, theatrical fits of torment. Enraged by the acquittal, Chief Justice Stoughton turned to the jury and openly questioned their decision, asking if they had properly considered a statement Nurse had made during the trial. Under this immense public and judicial pressure, the unnerved jury reconsidered. They changed their verdict to guilty, and an innocent woman was condemned to hang. In an age of coarse confessions and terrified pleas, the story of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer, stands as a monument to unbreakable will. Accused of witchcraft alongside his wife, Corey knew the court was a sham and that a conviction was inevitable. So he deployed a radical and arcane legal tactic. He refused to enter a plea. By standing mute before the court and refusing to say the words guilty or not guilty, he legally prevented his trial from proceeding. His motive was not to save his own life, which he knew was forfeit, but to protect his family. Without a conviction for witchcraft, the state could not legally seize his property, ensuring his farm would pass to his 2 sons-in-law. The court's response to Corey's defiance was a medieval form of torture known as peine forte et dure, the strong and hard pain. He was stripped naked. A heavy board was placed on his chest, and then, one by one, large stones were piled on top, the crushing weight intended to force a plea from his lips. For 2 days, Corey endured the unimaginable agony in silence. When the sheriff would demand a plea, he would only gasp a defiant response. According to legend, his final, famous words uttered as his body was being crushed were a terse and contemptuous demand: more weight. He died under that load, undefeated, a martyr who chose a torturous death to expose the court's cruelty and protect his family's legacy. Giles Corey's decision to remain silent was a brilliant, final act of rebellion against a system he knew to be corrupt. Under the English law of the time, a legal principle known as forfeiture upon attainder dictated that a person convicted of a felony would have their property and land seized by the state. Corey understood this perfectly. He knew a trial meant a certain conviction. By refusing to plead, he short-circuited the entire legal process. He ensured that, legally, he was never tried or convicted of anything. In choosing a torturous death, he achieved his ultimate goal. He nullified the court's power over his legacy and guaranteed that his hard-won farm would pass to his heirs. A final, defiant victory secured for his family from beyond the grave. The punishment for standing mute was an archaic and brutal form of torture called peine forte et dure. Giles Corey was taken to an open field, staked to the ground, and a heavy wooden plank was laid across his body. Then, for 2 agonizing days, the sheriff and his assistants piled heavy stones onto the board, slowly and deliberately crushing him. They hoped the unbearable pressure would force a plea from his lips. Yet, through it all, the 81-year-old farmer remained steadfast. When the sheriff demanded that he finally enter a plea, Corey, with what little breath he had left in his broken body, reportedly uttered just 2 words, a final, contemptuous command to his tormentors. The relentless engine of the witch trials only began to sputter and stall when the accusations started to climb the social ladder. For months, the targets had been misfits, outcasts, and the poor. But as the hysteria spiraled out of control, the afflicted girls grew bolder, and their pointing fingers began to find more prominent targets. They accused wealthy merchants, respected ministers, and even, according to legend, Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of the Massachusetts royal governor himself. Suddenly, the colony's elite, who had been content to let the madness consume the lower classes, felt a chill of self-preservation. When their own necks were on the line, their perspective on the trial's legitimacy began to change with remarkable speed. The critical turning point that brought the Salem witch trials to an end was a single, decisive executive order from Governor William Phipps. Pressured by influential ministers like Increase Mather and likely concerned by the accusation against his own wife, the governor finally intervened. He ordered the court to stop admitting spectral evidence. This decision was monumental. It effectively kicked the central legal pillar out from under the entire prosecution. Without the ability to use the accuser's visions and dreams as proof of guilt, the cases against the remaining accused fell apart. The conviction machine, which had been churning out death sentences for months, ground to an immediate and unceremonious halt. In the years that followed the trials, a slow and painful process of public reckoning began. The community was forced to confront the innocent blood on its hands. In 1697, the General Court ordered a day of fasting and soul-searching for the tragedy it had allowed. One of the judges, Samuel Sewell, stood up in his Churston and had his public apology read aloud, accepting the blame and shame for his role. In stark contrast, the chief architect of the trials, William Stoughton, never expressed a shred of remorse. Reportedly storming out of a meeting when it was suggested the judges had been mistaken, the colony eventually overturned many of the convictions and offered some financial compensation to the victims' families. But it was a quiet, incomplete apology for an unforgivable injustice. The Salem witch trials, despite involving a relatively small number of victims compared to their European counterparts, have cast a disproportionately long shadow over American history and identity. The event has become a foundational cautionary tale, a dark mirror held up to the nation's highest ideals. The term witch hunt entered the American lexicon as a powerful shorthand for any persecution fueled by mass hysteria, false accusations, and the abuse of power. Salem serves as a permanent and chilling reminder that the line between civic order and mob rule can be terrifyingly thin, and that fear, when weaponized by the state, can lead a supposedly righteous society to commit monstrous acts. More than 2.5 centuries later, in the tense atmosphere of 1950s America, the playwright Arthur Miller found himself watching the ghosts of Salem being resurrected. The nation was in the grip of the Red Scare, a period of intense anti-communist paranoia led by Senator Joseph McCarthy. As Miller observed the televised hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, he was struck by the chilling parallels. He saw the same pattern of public accusation, the pressure to name names, and the destruction of reputations based on flimsy evidence and association. He realized that the political dynamics of McCarthyism were a modern echo of the same human frailties that had consumed Salem in 1692. Driven by this revelation, Arthur Miller wrote his 1953 masterpiece, The Crucible. The play is a brilliant work of historical allegory, using the specific events of the Salem witch trials to mount a searing critique of the contemporary McCarthy-era witch hunts. On the surface, it's a gripping historical drama, but for audiences in the 1950s, the subtext was unmistakable. The imperious Judge Danforth was a clear stand-in for Senator McCarthy. The tragic hero, John Proctor, who refuses to sacrifice his integrity by making a false confession, became a powerful symbol for the artists and intellectuals who were being blacklisted and persecuted for their political beliefs, reminding audiences that the fight for one's good name was a timeless American struggle. At the heart of The Crucible is a profound exploration of reputation, integrity, and the terrifying power of lies. The play's central conflict revolves around its protagonist, John Proctor, and his desperate struggle to protect what he calls his name. In the play, one's name represents more than just a title. It is the essence of one's character, honor, and place in the community. When the court demands he sign a false confession that will be nailed to the church door, Proctor makes his final stand, famously crying out, "Because it is my name! Because I cannot have another in my life!" This theme resonated deeply with an America where careers, friendships, and lives were being systematically destroyed by public accusation alone. Ultimately, the story of Salem endures because it serves as a powerful and timeless symbol of the dangers that arise when a society allows fear to overwhelm reason. It is a perfect, horrifying case study in the anatomy of injustice. The events of 1692 reveal how a combination of religious extremism, social anxiety, personal resentments, and a catastrophic failure of legal due process can create a vortex of madness that consumes an entire community. The trials serve as a perpetual warning that the demons we should fear most are not the supernatural phantoms we imagine in the dark, but the very real ones that reside within ourselves: prejudice, fanaticism, and the terrifying power of the mob. Let us now journey further back in time to the chaotic final days of the Roman Republic. In a world almost entirely dominated by men, where women were expected to be demure, domestic, and politically invisible, one woman shattered every convention. Her name was Fulvia. She was not a quiet matron managing a household. She was a fierce political operator, an ambitious power broker, and a ruthless adversary who wielded influence with a skill and ferocity that rivaled any senator or general of her time. Through her wealth, her intellect, and a series of strategic marriages, Fulvia rose to become one of the most powerful and controversial figures in an age of legendary men. To understand Fulvia's incredible rise to power, you first have to understand the fundamental political schism that was tearing the Roman Republic apart. This was the bitter and often violent conflict between two opposing factions, the Optimates and the Populares. These were not formal political parties like we have today, with membership cards and party platforms. Rather, they were shifting alliances, and, more accurately, two competing political ideologies that represented a deep fault line running through Roman society, defining the struggle for the soul of the Republic. The Optimates, whose name translates to the best men, were the defenders of the Roman establishment. This faction was composed of the traditional, conservative, and wealthy aristocratic families who believed that power should remain firmly in the hands of the Senate. They were the old guard, committed to preserving the ancient traditions and hierarchical structure of the Republic. They viewed any attempt to grant more power to the common people or to a single popular leader as a grave threat to stability, and they fought fiercely to protect the Senate's authority and their own privileged position at the top of Roman society. In direct opposition to the establishment stood the Populares, all the men of the people. This faction included ambitious aristocrats who chose to bypass the authority of the Senate and seek power by appealing directly to the Roman populace. They championed popular causes like land reform for soldiers, debt relief for the poor, and subsidized grain for the urban masses. By using the assemblies of the people and the powerful office of the tribune, the populares could rally public support to challenge the entrenched power of the Optimates, making them a disruptive and revolutionary force in Roman politics. Fulvia was born and bred in the heart of the populares faction. She was not merely adjacent to this political movement, she was a central figure in what amounted to a populist dynasty. Both her father and grandfather had been prominent populares, and, most significantly, all three of her husbands would become leading figures in the fight against the Optimate establishment. This alignment was the source of her power and influence. She was a key player in a political network that sought to fundamentally reshape Roman society, and she used her considerable wealth and political acumen to advance the cause of her faction and, by extension, herself. Fulvia's first marriage placed her at the epicenter of Roman street politics. Her husband was Publius Clodius Pulcher, one of the most notorious and effective populares of his generation. Clodius was a brilliant but volatile aristocrat who renounced his noble status to become a tribune of the plebs, an office he used to push a radical populist agenda. He was infamous for his use of organized street gangs to intimidate his Optimate rivals, including the great orator Cicero and the general Pompey. Life with Clodius was a masterclass in the violent and theatrical nature of late Republican politics, a lesson Fulvia clearly learned well. When Clodius was murdered in a violent street brawl with a rival gang, Fulvia made her dramatic debut on the Roman political stage. Instead of mourning in private as a typical Roman widow would, she engaged in an audacious act of political theatre. She took her husband's battered and bloody corpse and displayed it publicly in the Roman Forum. She wept and pointed to his wounds, deliberately inciting the grief and fury of the Roman mob who had adored him. Her gambit worked perfectly. Enraged, the mob carried Clodius's body to the Senate house and burned it to the ground, using the building itself as a funeral pyre, a powerful, symbolic act of populist rage that Fulvia herself had unleashed. After the chaos following Clodius's death subsided, Fulvia married again, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio. This was another politically strategic alliance that kept her firmly within the inner circle of the populares. Curio, once an opponent of Julius Caesar, had been famously bought off with a massive bribe and became one of Caesar's most crucial and effective political agents in the lead-up to the civil war against Pompey and the Optimates. Although Curio was killed in battle a short time later, this marriage further cemented Fulvia's credentials and connections within the Caesarian faction, the most powerful political force in Rome. Fulvia's third and final marriage was the one that elevated her to the absolute pinnacle of Roman power. She married Mark Antony, Julius Caesar's most charismatic general and his right-hand man. After Caesar's assassination, Antony would go on to form the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, effectively becoming one of the three military dictators ruling the Roman world. As the wife of a triumvir, Fulvia was no longer just an influential widow or a political operator behind the scenes. She was now, for all practical purposes, a ruling queen, wielding immense authority in Antony's name and becoming a major political force in her own right. In the turbulent years following Julius Caesar's assassination, while Mark Antony was often abroad securing the eastern provinces, Fulvia's power reached its zenith. She was not a passive wife waiting for her husband's return. She was his fierce and capable representative in the capital. She actively managed his political interests, courted his legions, and ruthlessly maneuvered against his rivals, particularly the young and ambitious Octavian. During this period, Fulvia's influence was so great that she was effectively a co-ruler of Rome, a woman who had broken every barrier to achieve a level of political power unprecedented for her gender in the history of the Republic. In the Roman world, Coinage was the primary form of mass media, a way for the state to project its power and ideology directly into the hands of its citizens. The images stamped on gold and silver were almost exclusively of gods, historical symbols, or, eventually, the male rulers themselves. It was in this context that Fulvia achieved something truly revolutionary. Her face appeared on a series of coins, often depicted as the goddess Victory. This was an unprecedented act, the first time a living Roman woman, who was not a foreign queen, was granted this honor. It was a stunning and audacious declaration of her status, transforming her from a political wife into a symbol of the state itself, a tangible representation of her immense influence that everyone from a legionary in Gaul to a merchant in Rome could see and touch. Following the formation of Second Triumvirate, a wave of state-sanctioned terror washed over Rome. This was the era of the proscriptions, a cold-blooded and systematic purge of political enemies. Lists were posted daily in the Forum, condemning hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy equestrians to death without trial. Their property was confiscated by the state, and bounty hunters were dispatched to collect their heads. It was a time of absolute lawlessness, where old scores were settled, families were torn apart, and the streets ran with the blood of the Republic's elite. And Fulvia was not merely a passive beneficiary of this slaughter. Ancient sources paint her as an enthusiastic and vengeful participant, personally overseeing the destruction of her family's political foes. Our most vivid and disturbing accounts of Fulvia's role in this reign of terror come to us from the Roman historian Cassius Dio. Writing over a century later, Dio compiled the stories and testimonies that had survived, painting a portrait of a woman driven by a ferocious appetite for vengeance. He describes how she would personally review the severed heads of the proscribed, which were brought to her home for inspection before the bounties were paid, in a city paralyzed by fear, where citizens dared not even make eye contact with the powerful. Fulvia's residence became a gruesome clearinghouse for political murder, a place where the grim accounting of the Triumvirate's purge was finalized with her personal approval. The most infamous story recounted by Cassius Dio concerns the fate of Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and Mark Antony's most hated enemy. After Cicero was hunted down and killed, his head and hands were brought back to Rome and presented to Antony. But the final, most personal desecration was reserved for Fulvia. According to Dio, she took the severed head into her lap, spat upon the face of the man who had so often attacked her husbands in his speeches, and pulled open his mouth. Then, in a final, symbolic act of contempt, she took the pins she used to fasten her hair and repeatedly stabbed and pierced the tongue that had once commanded the Roman Senate, silencing the Republic's most eloquent voice forever. While her husband, Mark Antony, was in the eastern provinces, dallying with Cleopatra and securing the loyalty of the legions, there a dangerous power vacuum formed in Rome. It was Fulvia who stepped into this void. She was Antony's anchor in the capital, and she ruled with an iron will. She was not a mere placeholder. She was the acting head of the Antonian faction, managing vast financial resources, directing political strategy, and ensuring the loyalty of the veteran soldiers who were the backbone of her husband's power. It was during this period that she came into direct and open conflict with her primary rival, Antony's young, cunning, and dangerously ambitious partner in the Triumvirate, Octavian. The fragile alliance of the Second Triumvirate was destined to fracture, and the first major crack was the Prussian War. This was not a foreign conflict. It was a brutal Italian civil war, a direct clash between two competing centers of power. On one side was Octavian, who was in Italy attempting to settle veteran soldiers on confiscated land, a move that made him immensely popular. On the other side were Fulvia and Antony's brother, Lucius Antonius, who saw Octavian's growing influence as a direct threat to Antony's authority. Fulvia took the lead, championing the cause of the dispossessed Italian landowners and positioning herself as the true defender of her husband's interests, setting the stage for an inevitable and bloody confrontation. During the Prussian War, Fulvia shattered every Roman convention about the role of women. She was not content to simply influence events from behind the scenes. She took on the role of a military commander. Ancient sources describe her as being actively involved in the war effort, even wearing a sword in public as she reviewed the troops. She was instrumental in raising legions loyal to Antony and was a key voice in dictating their strategic deployment. For a Roman woman to assume such a public, martial role was utterly scandalous and unheard of. She was no longer just the wife of a general. In the eyes of her enemies and supporters alike, she had become a general herself. This brutal civil war was fought not only with swords and spears, but also with words, a fascinatingly crude and personal form of psychological warfare. Archaeologists have unearthed a unique and telling type of ammunition used in the conflict: lead sling bullets. These were small, acorn-shaped projectiles that were cheap to produce and deadly when slung at high velocity. But what makes them truly remarkable is that both sides took the time to inscribe them with messages. Before hurling these bullets at the enemy, soldiers would carve short, sharp insults and taunts into the soft lead, creating a kind of ancient, weaponized social media designed to demoralize and mock their opponents with every volley. The messages inscribed on the bullets used by Octavian's forces were often deeply personal and shockingly vulgar, aimed squarely at Mark Antony, and in particular, at Fulvia. These were not sophisticated political arguments. They were crude, schoolyard taunts intended to humiliate. Sling bullets have been found bearing inscriptions that translate to, "I'm aiming for Fulvia's clitoris," a testament to the deeply misogynistic nature of the attacks against her. Others mocked Mark Antony directly by targeting Fulvia with such sexually explicit insults. Octavian's propaganda sought to undermine her authority by attacking her gender and painting her as a transgressive woman who had overstepped her bounds. Fulvia and Lucius Antonius gave as good as they got. Their side produced their own arsenal of inscribed sling bullets, firing their own pointed insults back across the battlefield. Bullets from the Antonian side have been found with messages aimed directly at their rival, reading Octavian, "You bald-headed cuckold," or simply Lucius Antonius the Bold, and Fulvia. This tangible back and forth reveals a propaganda war that was as bitter and personal as the physical fighting itself. It shows two sides using every tool at their disposal to not only defeat, but also to deeply humiliate their enemies, turning every volley of ammunition into a barrage of personal insults. The war reached its grim climax at the ancient hilltop city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia. It was here that Fulvia, along with Lucius Antonius and their remaining forces, was trapped and besieged by Octavian's larger army. Octavian chose not to risk a costly direct assault. Instead, He surrounded the city with impenetrable earthworks and settled in for a long siege, choosing to wield the slow, cruel, and brutally effective weapon of starvation. For months, the defenders of Perugia slowly wasted away, cut off from all supplies. The situation became so desperate that, according to reports, the famine inside the city walls grew to be legendary, a symbol of the war's utter desperation. When Perugia finally fell, Octavian proved himself to be a master of political maneuvering. He needed to punish the rebellion, but he could not afford to completely alienate the powerful Mark Antony. So, he executed the local senators of Perugia, but shrewdly pardoned Antony's brother, Lucius. He then directed all the blame for the conflict onto a single, convenient target, Fulvia. He publicly declared that the entire war had been her fault, stoked by her personal ambition and shrewish nature. It was a brilliant piece of political spin. It allowed him to emerge as the victor, while preserving his fragile alliance with Antony. And it cemented for all of history the narrative of Fulvia as a destructive, out-of-control woman. Defeated, disgraced, and exiled from Italy, Fulvia made her way to Athens, where she was to have her final, tragic meeting with her husband, Mark Antony. She arrived not as the powerful regent who had fiercely protected his interests, but as a political liability, the woman who was being blamed for a disastrous civil war. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, the reunion was cold and strained. Antony, who was now focused on his own political survival and his relationship with Octavian, reportedly treated her with a mixture of anger and indifference. She had gambled everything to protect his power, and in the end, she found herself abandoned by the very man she had fought for. Shortly after her disastrous reunion with Antony in Greece, Fulvia fell ill and died. Her death could not have come at a more politically opportune moment for the men who ruled Rome. Her passing removed a significant source of friction between the two most powerful triumvirs. Antony, freed from his politically troublesome wife, was able to use her death as a pretext for a grand reconciliation with Octavian. The two men met, patched up their differences, and sealed their new pact of friendship in the traditional Roman way with a marriage. Antony married Octavian's virtuous and respected sister, Octavia, a union that symbolized a new era of peace, built conveniently upon Fulvia's grave. Fulvia's legacy is a complex and cautionary tale, one that was almost entirely written by the men who defeated her. She was undeniably ambitious, ruthless, and politically brilliant, a woman who shattered every Roman gender norm to seize a level of power that was unthinkable for her time. She operated as an equal alongside the most powerful men in Rome. However, because she ultimately lost her final, high-stakes gamble against Octavian, history has remembered her not as a pioneer, but as a villain. She became a caricature of the dangerous, power-hungry woman, a narrative conveniently crafted by her male rivals that has defined her image for over 2,000 years. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom lives in the American memory as a single, glorious tableau. Martin Luther King Jr. standing before the Lincoln Memorial, sharing his iconic dream with the world. But behind that one transcendent moment was a monumental feat of political and logistical organization, an undertaking of such immense scale and complexity that its success was anything but guaranteed. It required navigating the treacherous crosscurrents of rival civil rights organizations, placating a nervous Kennedy administration, and managing the daunting task of peacefully bringing 250,000 people to the nation's capital. It was a masterpiece of planning, orchestrated by a man who was deliberately kept hidden from the spotlight. While Dr. King was the undeniable spiritual leader of the march, its chief architect and logistical mastermind was a man whose name is often relegated to a historical footnote: Bayard Rustin. Rustin was the indispensable operational commander, the man who translated the grand vision of the march's leaders into a detailed, functioning reality. It was Rustin who sat at the center of the chaotic web of planning, coordinating every minute detail and solving every complex problem. The triumphant success of that August day was, in large part, a direct result of his strategic brilliance, tireless work, and unparalleled gift for organization. Bayard Rustin was uniquely qualified for this monumental task. He was a lifelong activist, deeply committed to the principles of non-violent resistance, which he had studied directly in India under the disciples of Mahatma Gandhi. As a Quaker, non-violence was not just a tactic for him, it was a core spiritual belief. This philosophical grounding was combined with decades of practical, on-the-ground experience organizing protests and civil disobedience actions for the labor and civil rights movements. He was both a profound moral thinker and a nuts and bolts pragmatist, a rare combination of talents that made him the ideal person to stage one of the largest peaceful protests in American history. The sheer scale of Rustin's planning was breathtaking. Working out of a bustling headquarters in Harlem with a small, dedicated staff, he mapped out every conceivable detail in just 2 months. He coordinated the chartering of more than 2,000 buses and dozens of trains, directing them to specific parking areas to avoid gridlock. He recruited and trained over 4,000 volunteer marshals to manage the crowd and keep the peace. He arranged for first aid stations, organized the printing of tens of thousands of signs, and even calculated the precise number of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, 80,000, that would be needed to feed the volunteer staff. It was a logistical triumph. Despite being the brilliant organizer and operational engine of the march, Bayard Rustin was denied the public recognition he so richly deserved. The other leaders of the march, while respecting his genius, were acutely aware of the political liabilities he carried. Rustin was an openly gay man in an era when homosexuality was viciously condemned and pathologized. Furthermore, he had been a member of the Young Communist League in his youth, a fact that segregationist politicians were eager to weaponize. To shield the march from attack, the other leaders insisted that Rustin take the title of deputy director, allowing the more publicly palatable A. Philip Randolph to serve as the official director. Although Rustin was doing the lion's share of the work, the reasons for sidelining Bayard Rustin were twofold, and in the context of 1960s America, they were considered political dynamite. Firstly, Rustin was an openly gay man in an era of deep-seated, institutionalized homophobia. This fact alone was seen as a weapon that could be used by segregationists to discredit the entire movement, painting it as morally corrupt. Secondly, in his much younger days, he had been briefly involved with the Young Communist League, an affiliation he had long since renounced. In the hyper-paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, this past association was a scarlet letter, allowing opponents to smear the march as a subversive, anti-American plot. The leadership, fearing that these personal details could overshadow the march's vital message, made the painful decision to keep their most brilliant strategist in the shadows. The fears of the march leadership proved to be well-founded. Just weeks before the event, Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, one of the nation's most powerful and ardent segregationists, stood on the floor of the U.S. Senate had launched a vicious, personal attack against Rustin. Thurmond denounced him as a communist, draft dodger, and homosexual, intending to use this character assassination to implode the march from within and scare away mainstream support. It was a desperate, ugly attempt to derail the movement by targeting its most vulnerable organizer. In a remarkable act of solidarity, however, Philip Randolph and the other leaders refused to buckle. They defended Rustin, stared down the attack, and affirmed his indispensable role, refusing to sacrifice him to political pressure. The public face of the March on Washington was a formidable but often contentious coalition of leaders, known as the Big Six. This group comprised the heads of the most powerful civil rights organizations of the day: Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, Whitney Young of the National Urban League, Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, James Farmer of CORE, John Lewis of SNCC, and of course Martin Luther King Jr. of the SCLC. These were powerful, proud men who were often rivals for funding, influence, and strategic direction. Forging a united front among them was a monumental challenge in itself, requiring constant negotiation and compromise. It was this delicate, high-stakes diplomacy that made Rustin's behind-the-scenes, unifying operational role all the more essential. Representing the youngest and most militant wing of the movement was John Lewis, the passionate and courageous chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC's, pronounced SNCC. This organization was made up of young activists who were on the front lines of the struggle, enduring brutal beatings and illegal jailings during the freedom rides and voter registration drives in the Deep South. They were tired of the slow, deliberative pace of their elders and deeply skeptical of the federal government's commitment to their cause. At just 23 years old, Lewis was tasked with giving voice to this righteous impatience, representing a generation that was done asking politely for its freedom and was ready to demand it. The speech that John Lewis prepared to deliver was not meant to be a soothing bomb of unity. It was intended to be a fiery indictment of the political establishment. It was a raw cry of frustration from the grassroots, reflecting the anger of SNCC activists who felt betrayed by the slow pace of change. Lewis's original draft was a direct and confrontational challenge, not just to the overt racism of the South, but to the perceived indifference and hypocrisy of the Kennedy administration. He planned to condemn the president's proposed civil rights bill as being too little and too late, and to ask a question that cut to the very heart of the movement's frustration. I want to know, which side is the federal government on? The original text of Lewis's speech was laced with rhetoric that the more moderate leaders found deeply alarming. It was a declaration of war against the entire system of segregation. He planned to accuse both the Democratic and Republican parties of betraying the cause of justice and to declare that SNCC would not be patient. The most inflammatory passage, however, was a historical analogy that struck terror into the hearts of the other organizers. Lewis intended to declare that the time for patience was over and that civil rights activists would march through the South, through the heart of Dixie, the way Sherman did, a direct and explosive reference to the Union generals' famously destructive march during the Civil War. To the march's leadership, this reference to General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea was completely unacceptable. Sherman's campaign had carved a path of total destruction through Georgia and the Carolinas, and the phrase, "scorched earth," was synonymous with a particularly brutal and punitive kind of warfare. For Lewis to invoke that memory was, in their view, a dangerous incitement. It sounded like a threat of black-on-white violence, a complete betrayal of the movement's core principle of nonviolence. They feared it would alienate white allies, give segregationists an excuse to crack down with even more brutality, and irrevocably damage the carefully curated image of a peaceful, morally righteous protest. The crisis over the speech came to a head just hours before it was set to begin. Patrick O'Boyle, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Washington, D.C., had obtained a copy of the text. Horrified by what he read, he delivered a stark ultimatum. If John Lewis delivered the speech as written, he would withdraw from the event and refuse to give the opening invocation. This was a catastrophic threat. The participation of religious leaders like O'Boyle was crucial to framing the march as a moral, spiritual, and interfaith crusade for justice. His departure would have shattered the image of unity the leaders had worked so hard to build, and it put immense pressure on the other organizers to rein Lewis in. With the entire event on the brink of chaos, it was the esteemed elder statesman of the movement, A. Philip Randolph, who intervened. For decades, Randolph had been a towering figure in the fight for labor and civil rights, and he commanded universal respect. Instead of demanding that Lewis change the speech, he made a gentle but firm personal appeal. He put his arm around the young man and said, "John, we've come this far together. Let's stay together." It was a plea for unity, a reminder from a revered mentor that the collective power of their coalition was more important than any single, fiery speech. It was this appeal to their shared struggle, not a command, that finally persuaded Lewis to consider making changes. What followed was an extraordinary scene of frantic, last-minute diplomacy. In a small, cramped room, just behind the statue of Abraham Lincoln, a huddle of leaders, including Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr., and other SNCC officials, surrounded John Lewis. With the sounds of the growing crowd and the opening speakers audible just outside, they engaged in a tense but collaborative negotiation over the text, literally rewriting the speech moments before Lewis was scheduled to walk out onto the podium. It was a painful process of line-by-line concessions, with Lewis fighting to retain the righteous anger of his message, while the others urged him to soften the most inflammatory and divisive language for the sake of the movement's unity. The final version of the speech, born of this last-minute crucible, was still a powerful and defiant address. However, the most explosive elements had been excised. The direct condemnation of the Kennedy administration's bill as too little, too late was removed. The incendiary threat to march through Dixie, the way Sherman did, was replaced with a more abstract, but still powerful, declaration that they would march through the South, through the streets of Jackson, through the streets of Danville, through the streets of Cambridge, through the streets of Birmingham. The speech retained its core of militant anger, but the edits were just enough to hold the fragile coalition together and avert a public schism on the national stage. This dramatic, behind-the-scenes conflict over a single speech laid bare the profound strategic and generational tensions that were simmering just beneath the surface of the civil rights movement. It was the embodiment of the central debate of the era, was the path to freedom through patient, pragmatic negotiation with the white power structure as advocated by the older, more established leaders? Or was it through radical, uncompromising, and confrontational direct action, as championed by the young activists of SNCC, who were risking their lives daily in the trenches of the Deep South? The March on Washington presented a powerful image of unity, but the argument over Lewis's speech revealed the deep fault lines that would continue to shape the movement for years to come. Despite the internal conflicts, the day itself was an unqualified and spectacular success. 250,000 people, black and white, young and old, gathered peacefully in the nation's capital, creating a sea of humanity that stretched from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. The atmosphere was not one of anger, but of joyful and determined hope. It was a powerful display of non-violent moral authority, a living testament to the righteousness of the cause. The march became a symbol of hope and a high-water mark for the movement, broadcasting a message of peaceful, resolute dignity to a captivated nation and a watching world. The extraordinary optimism and sense of triumph generated by the March on Washington proved to be tragically and brutally short-lived. The powerful feelings of hope and national unity that emanated from the Lincoln Memorial were about to collide with the horrific reality of the violent hatred that still festered in the heart of the segregated South. Just as the nation was beginning to absorb the peaceful message of the march, an act of unimaginable barbarity would serve as a sickening reminder of the immense and deadly struggle that still lay ahead, shattering the hopeful atmosphere with shocking speed and violence. Just 18 days after the March on Washington, on the morning of Sunday, September 15, 1963, that violent hatred made itself known. Members of the Ku Klux Klan planted a box of dynamite under the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The church was a central meeting place for civil rights activists, a sanctuary and a symbol of black resilience. The bomb exploded just before the youth sermon was scheduled to begin, blowing a massive hole in the side of the building and collapsing walls and floors. It was a deliberate act of racist terrorism designed to strike fear into the heart of the black community by desecrating its most sacred space. The explosion ripped through the church basement, instantly killing 4 young girls who were there preparing for the Youth Day services. Their names became a rallying cry for the movement and a symbol of the ultimate price of racial hatred. Addie Mae Collins, 14, Cynthia Wesley, 42, Carol Robertson, Fam, and Carol Denise McNair, 11. The murder of these innocent children in their Sunday school dresses sent a shockwave of horror and revulsion across the nation and the world. Their deaths exposed the true, murderous depravity of segregation in a way that no speech or political debate ever could, laying bare the innocence of the victims and the profound evil of their killers. While the march had inspired many, the bombing horrified all. The brutal, senseless murder of 4 children in a house of worship was a crime so heinous that it shook the conscience of the nation. It galvanized public opinion in an unprecedented way, forcing many moderate white Americans who had been ambivalent about the civil rights movement to confront the sheer ugliness of the forces it was fighting against. The act of terrorism, intended to intimidate the movement into silence, had the exact opposite effect. It created a tidal wave of sympathy and moral outrage, strengthening the resolve of activists and creating immense public pressure for decisive federal action. The political fallout from the Birmingham bombing was immense. The moral outrage it generated created a new, powerful momentum for the very civil rights legislation that John Lewis had criticized as being too weak. The tragic deaths of the 4 girls made it politically impossible for opponents of the bill to continue their obstruction. The bombing served as a bloody catalyst, providing President Lyndon B. Johnson, who took office after Kennedy's assassination just 2 months later, with the moral leverage he needed to push the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 through a reluctant Congress. The law was, in a very real sense, written in the blood of the children murdered in that church. Looking back, the March on Washington cannot be viewed as a simple, standalone moment of triumph. It is more accurately understood as a complex and poignant historical moment, suspended precariously between the fiery internal debates of the movement and the horrific external violence of its enemies. It was a day where the strategic tensions between radicalism and moderation were negotiated in real time, just out of public view. And it was a day whose immense hope was immediately answered by an act of unspeakable terror. This context reveals the full, complicated truth of the struggle, battle fought not only on the streets and at the Lincoln Memorial, but also behind the scenes and in the face of unimaginable loss. Therefore, the enduring legacy of the March on Washington is profoundly dual. On one hand, it remains the high watermark of nonviolent protest, a shining symbol of hope and the power of a unified moral voice to appeal to the conscience of a nation. It is remembered for Dr. King's dream of a world redeemed by love and brotherhood. On the other hand, its story is forever intertwined with the bombing that followed, a brutal reminder of the violent, hate-filled reality the movement was fighting against. The march and the bombing, together, tell the complete story, the soaring dream of what America could be, and the nightmarish reality of what it still was.